I've got a goal of going 6s and 200 miles per hour in the quarter mile with my stock block LS. Today I was going to talk about a little bit of the changes that we need to make to the car and some of the changes that we already have made in order to make that happen. So first of all, we'll just talk about the changes that we made in the last video that you guys may have caught, where I was talking about the tire selection and how I pick which tire to run and some of the differences. And if you've seen that video, then you've seen where we put these radials on, and I've got those all mounted on the car, of course. I also made another change to the front tires. I went to a radial there as well, not because that's going to give me any performance advantage, but because I am planning to run that 6-second pass, or attempt that 6-second pass I should say, at Texas 2K, which is actually pretty cool because I ran my first 7-second pass there about 4 years ago in 2019 with my Blue Fox body. I went a 791 at 170, and that was with my stock bottom end 4.8, and that was actually whenever I first broke the stock bottom end 4.8 record, and that was a really fun event to do that at, and it was a good track surface, so that's why we're going back and seeing if I can run my first 6-second pass there. So that should be pretty cool. The reason that I have to have a DOT tire, it is on the front, is because I am going to be running in the street car class. I figure if we're going to go there, we might as well compete since we fit in the class as well. So just had to change the front tires. The car is already registered and insured and fits all the other rules, drives to the lanes and back after every pass. So we fit that class, so we'll see how we can do. Not really worried about winning the class or anything. The main focus is just trying to get that 6-second quarter mile pass and that 200 miles per hour. So another change that I have to make that I've not done yet is the rear gear. So I'll show you this center section that I have right here. I have a 9-inch in this car, of course, and right now I actually do not have my center section in the car. I have my good friend Brendan Dickinson's center section. They're exactly the same, other than the fact that his has a 411 gear in it, because he has always just focused on 8th mile stuff, and mine had a 411 gear in it, but I ended up swapping to a 350 gear whenever I first set the goal to run in the quarter mile. And then we ended up getting into some no prep stuff last year and didn't end up running any quarter miles, so I actually ended up borrowing his 411 center section to see if we can do a little bit better on that 8th mile no prep stuff, and it did help out quite a bit, so really appreciate him for letting me borrow that. But we're going to give that back to him since his car is getting closer to being finished, and then we're going to put that 350 rear gear back in the car so we can have enough gear to be able to run to the quarter mile. I am still going to be running a fairly high RPM at the quarter mile with that 350 gear, but of course it wouldn't even be possible with the 411 gear. The 350 gear at 200 miles per hour, it's going to depend on how much converter slip I have, but I believe if I end up having 3 or 4% or something like that, which I think is a fairly realistic estimate of where it will be, then I'm going to be up near 9,000 RPM. It should be 8,800 RPM, and that is pretty much all I want to spin this motor. It's probably a bit higher than I should spin it, but I don't want to give up too much of the short track in order to be able to go through the traps at a better RPM. I would rather lose a little bit of mile per hour than lose the 60-foot and the early track ET numbers, because that's what's going to get us that 6-second pass easier than the mile per hour, due to the fact that, of course, it is a stock block LS. We're not We don't have unlimited power. We can't just, you know, leave real soft and make 2,500 horsepower and run it out the back and make up for a slow 60-foot time. So we're trying to kind of meet in the middle there with the 350 rear gear. Ideally, I would like to go through the traps probably 8,400 at the highest, and that's where I was going through the traps with the 411 in the 8th mile, trapping a little bit over 150 miles per hour. Speaking of the 8th mile, we are going to have to go faster than we've ever gone to that as well. However, I have not had this car with the forged motor on radials yet on a good track, so we should be able to go quite a bit faster with that nice motor instead of the stock bottom end 4.8, where I actually went 471 at 149 with that. Speaking of the engine, as you can see, that is currently missing. We will talk more about that in a later video and go over some of the things that are happening with it, but our friends over at the Scoggin Dickey Race Shop are taking care of that for me, and we should have that back fairly soon, and we'll go over some of the specifics of what is done to the engine and what has happened in the past with it. But to get more into the gear ratio, and as I said, I don't want to give up too much of the 60-foot or, you know, the early track ET numbers. You may be questioning why I say that. Well, one of the most important factors in building a race car is having the proper starting line ratio for what you're trying to do. And basically, if you don't know, the starting line ratio is your first gear in your transmission multiplied by the rear gear. So I have a Power Glide transmission with a 169 first gear ratio, so that's going to be 1.69 multiplied by my rear gear, which in this case we're going to be swapping to the 350, as I said. So basically what that starting line ratio number is a multiplier of the torque produced by the engine. So of course, if you have a higher starting line ratio, because for example, if you have a TH400 transmission with the stock gear ratios, you're going to have a 248 first gear. That's going to multiply the torque a lot more than a 169 first gear in my example. What you're doing there is you're not going to be required to make as much torque from the engine in order to achieve the same torque at the wheels. You may think, well, you want to have the highest multiplier possible, so you don't have to make as much power, or you don't have to make as much power to achieve the same torque at the wheels. Well, there are some downsides of that as well. That's why I say that it's very important to have the proper starting line ratio, not the highest starting line ratio. So one thing that you can run into with having too high of a starting line ratio is the car will be very finicky with changes, and it will not be consistent just because that multiplier is so high. Let's say that with a turbo car, you're never going to have exactly the same boost or power being produced when you leave the line. It could vary. Usually if you have it tuned properly, you're not going to see much more than 0.2, 0.3 psi difference, but that can be a pretty significant difference, especially if you have a very efficient engine where 1 pound of boost can be 50 horsepower or even a lot more than that. You're going to see a pretty big difference there if you have, just for an example, if somehow you had a 10 to 1 starting line ratio, which would be very, very high and probably not going to work very well. That means, if you see a 10 foot-pound difference in the torque produced at the engine, that's going to be 100 foot-pounds at the wheel. So that could be a very big difference, and that could be the difference between either, getting traction or not and spinning the tires, or it can also be the difference between wheeling and not wheeling. So if you have too aggressive of a starting line ratio, it's going to be very hard to manage. It's going to be very inconsistent because of that reasoning, as I said. Also, if you have a engine that produces quite a bit of power, it can be hard to turn it down enough to make the hit soft enough to not go into a wheelie or a spin. If your engine makes a lot of power, then you may not be able to turn it down enough, or you may have to leave on 1 or 2 pounds of boost. And another issue that you can run into from that is, if you have to leave at 1 or 2 pounds of boost, then the turbo is going to be a bit laggy and not as responsive. So if you need 1 pound of boost whenever you leave the line, and say 30-40 pounds of boost at 1.5-2 seconds after you've probably made a gear change and need a lot more power, then you're going to have a hard time doing that, or it can be hard to control, because a lot of times whenever you kind of are not on top of that turbo, it will kind of just spool whenever it decides to instead of whenever you are telling it to. So that's one of the disadvantages of having too much gear ratio. However, the issue that I'm going to have, or could possibly have, I should say, is not having enough starting line ratio, where it's going to be kind of hard for me to produce the amount of torque that I need to 60 foot as fast as I need to run the times that I'm trying to run. Since I don't have a very large engine or a lot of power, I'm going to probably have to leave on quite a bit of RPM and boost in order to make enough power, make enough torque to 60 foot the way that I need to. I'm probably going to need to run somewhere in the low 160 foot range, which this car has previously been 109 with the 4.8. So I'm not worried about the chassis being able to do it, just worried about if we can make enough power fast enough to do it. So we're probably gonna have to leave on quite a bit of boost and ramp it in very quickly in order to get that 60 foot time where we need to. I think that is going to be the most difficult factor, more than likely, in running the 6-second time. Also, we're going to need to go somewhere probably in the 450s to the 8th mile and around 160 miles per hour in order to get that. That should get us somewhere around the 690s and 200 miles per hour in the quarter mile. So we're going to have to get after it pretty hard, but we need to have that gear to be able to get through the quarter mile, of course. So we are going to get that changed out and see what we can do. Hopefully you guys learned a little bit about the starting line ratio. As I said, it's going to depend on what you're doing, how you decide what it should be. Another factor, of course, is going to be the surfaces that you're running on. If you're running on some really crappy surfaces, then you're going to want a lot lower starting line ratio, so the car is more manageable. It's going to, of course, depend on the engine and how much power you can produce, and your kind of range of power as well. If you have a big block where it makes 1,000 horsepower naturally aspirated, and then you add 14 pounds of boost or something like that, it's making nearly 2,000 horsepower. You're going to need a much lower starting line ratio than, say, if you had something on the complete other end of the spectrum, like a 2JZ or something like that, where it's making maybe 300-400 horsepower naturally aspirated, and probably 800 horsepower or so with 14 pounds of boost. So that's going to vary depending on what you're doing, what kind of surface you're on, what kind of engine you have, of course. So another thing I should mention about rear gear with a car with a torque converter like this, it's going to have a pretty large effect on how that torque converter acts. It's going to put a lot more load on that converter when you go to a numerically lower gear, like me going from the 350 or me going from the 411 to the 350. That's going to put a lot more load on the converter and make it act much looser. In fact, whenever I did the change last year from the 350 rear gear to the 411, I seen a 300 RPM difference in the flash RPM with the exact same converter, exact same tune-up. Everything was exactly the same other than the rear gear. So I believe the actual RPMs were 5,300 to 5,600 RPM. So that was a very big difference there. Another thing that will change quite a bit is your slip percentages at the finish line. It's of course going to depend on what RPM range your torque converter wants to live in and where it performs best. But in that example last year, where I swapped from the 350 to the 411, I ended up seeing a very large change in slip percentage. I went from 23% slip at the 8th mile down to a 7% slip. However, I think some people get a little too into that slip percentage number and think that it makes a huge difference. While it can make a pretty big difference, it is not as big of a deal as a lot of people think. In my opinion, because even while I had that 23-24% converter slip at the finish line in the 8th mile, I still had some pretty good performances and won quite a bit of races with that, where I know some people hearing that are probably thinking that is the end of the world and I'm losing a ton of performance from that. The differences that I seen in those 2 runs where it was exactly the same tune-up. The only change was the rear gear was just over a 1/10 of a second in ET, and most of that was made up in the 60-foot. I believe it went 500th quicker to the 60-foot, so that is where just about all of that was made up. And then the mile per hour picked up slightly. I believe it was within a couple mile per hour, so there's not a huge difference there from that 23% down to 7%, or not as big as some would expect, but that is another factor to consider. We'll talk a little bit more about the converter later on, as I have some pretty cool news on that. But yeah, we'll see you guys in the next one.